The first time the villagers saw the boy crawling under the abandoned truck in the scrapyard, they laughed, because what else could they do with a kid who claimed he could make engines run on water, and not just a few drops but enough to shake the dust off steel older than his father, and though his hands were small and his clothes were torn and his tools were borrowed from a junk dealer who let him pay in screws and favors, his eyes had a kind of stubborn glow that made some old men remember their own dreams before they became practical, which is why they watched from far away when the boy pulled out a jar of murky river water and whispered to himself like someone rehearsing an argument with the future, tracing equations in the dirt, converting fear into focus, because anyone can believe in a machine once it works, but it takes a special kind of foolish courage to believe while it's still a pile of rust and hope. And so when he connected thin copper tubing he scavenged from a refrigerator carcass and wrapped it around a blackened exhaust pipe to form a crude coil, no one understood that the boy wasn't playing mechanic, he was playing destiny, trying to prove that a miracle didn't need permission to exist, and when his uncle saw him and dragged him out by the collar shouting that engines drink petrol not puddles, the villagers nodded because the world prefers repeating the rules it inherited rather than testing the rules it hides, but the boy slipped out every night. After that, because if you're born without permission, you also learn to chase greatness without permission, and his experiments continued as quietly as a heartbeat under blankets of stars and mosquito bites, where failures didn't discourage him so much as educate him, because the metals expanded differently when heated, and the vapor pushed differently than liquid, and the coil needed to get hotter than he expected to crack the molecular bonds he couldn't name but could sense, and slowly the boy's confidence grew like vines through concrete, and though he knew he didn't yet have a working invention, he had something even rarer, momentum, and momentum is what turns ideas into defiance, and defiance is what brings a crowd when the sun finally rises on the day of proof, which is how, months later, a circle of villagers gathered around the scrapyard truck not because they believed him but because they wanted to see him fail loudly enough to be over with, while the boy tightened the last bolt. With breath that shook between panic and pride, and a man with a cigarette joked that even if engines could run on water, the government would ban the rain, and they all laughed, but laughter is the sound people make when confronting a dream they don't understand, and the boy didn't respond, he simply poured river water from the same glass jar into a small reservoir he'd welded from 2 oil cans, and connected a battered hose to a valve he made from plumbing scraps, and then he turned the ignition key that had no right to still work, and for a moment nothing happened except silence, which felt longer than childhood, until the coil hissed and the water inside began to tremble, and a puff of steam escaped like a secret tired of being trapped, and the engine coughed once, twice, then shook violently like a beast waking from an unwanted sleep, and the crowd stumbled back as the cylinders fired in a rhythm that sounded impossible, and for exactly 7 miraculous seconds that truck ran on. Nothing but the stubborn faith of a boy and a handful of water stolen from the river, until the coil ruptured and the hose burst and steam exploded into the air with a whistle that sent chickens running, and suddenly the dream was over, replaced by the loudest silence the village had ever heard, and though the experiment had failed, something more dangerous had succeeded, curiosity, because now the villagers were no longer laughing, now they were whispering, and whispering spreads faster than truth, and the boy knew it as he picked up the shattered coil from the ground like a fallen medal, but instead of celebrating he ran home, because geniuses are often shy in the exact moment the world becomes interested in them, and the next day the truck was gone from the scrapyard and rumors said a wealthy landowner with a taste for strange inventions had taken it, and rumors are often less powerful than the truth, but truth doesn't travel door to door the way gossip does, so no one knew that the landowner had watched the experiment from behind a half-broken wall, or that he had recognized the coil design from old engineering journals locked in his office, or that he believed the boy's mistake wasn't impossible science but insufficient heat, and while the villagers mocked the failure, the landowner sent a man in a black jacket to the boy's house with a message that would change the entire arc of the story, but before the message arrived the boy sat beside the river with his jar of water, watching how sunlight fractured across the surface, wondering if every miracle only looked like nonsense when viewed too close, and if every dream demanded humiliation before respect, because the world rarely rewards imagination politely, and it was there by the river that the boy made a promise to himself that the next time the engine roared it would roar long enough not just to shock the crowd, but to silence doubt, because silence is a sweeter applause than clapping when you're building. Something the world insisted could not be built, and while he whispered equations to the water, trying to understand the invisible laws that governed both machines and destiny, the man in the black jacket arrived and cleared his throat with the authority of someone who carried instructions rather than suggestions, and told the boy that the owner of the scrapyard truck wanted to meet him, and not tomorrow, not next week, but now. And as the boy followed him through the village, everyone stared in disbelief, because it is one thing to mock a dreamer and another to watch a dreamer be summoned, and somewhere in that confusion a seed of respect began to sprout, small but undeniable, and if you paused the story right there you could already feel the shape of something extraordinary forming, the kind of story that makes strangers argue on the internet and makes viewers stay all the way to the end of a video, because deep down everyone wants the underdog to win, not because winning matters, but because defiance tastes better than resignation. And it was at the gate of the landowner's estate that Chapter 1 truly ends, not with triumph, but with the kind of suspense that forces the question trapped in every curious mind: if the boy already made the impossible sputter to life, what will happen when someone with power decides to help him make it roar? The landowner's estate was nothing like the scrapyard, nothing like the riverbank, nothing like the noisy corridors of laughter the boy had grown accustomed to surviving, and as he walked past the tall gates with the man in the black jacket, he felt the oddest sensation, fear and validation performing a duet in his chest, because the world has a habit of revealing its opportunities behind doors you never expected to be invited through, and inside the courtyard the scrapyard truck stood in the sunlight, cleaned, lifted on hydraulic jacks, as though fate had dressed it for an engineering autopsy, and beside it stood the landowner, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, the kind of man who had spent a lifetime betting against the ordinary and winning. And he greeted the boy not with laughter or sarcasm but with interest, which is rarer than kindness, and said that he had seen the experiment, seen the coil rupture, seen the steam scream out of its confinement, and instead of declaring it impossible he asked the boy a question no villager had ever bothered to ask: how far did you intend for this idea to go? And the boy, who was more accustomed to insults than inquiries, shrugged and said he didn't know, only that maybe engines didn't need to burn the world to move through it.